Mark me. Golden sparks of lost control surged wildly in the dim bedroom. I gripped the hem of the man's shirt dead tight, forcing a devastating, desperate flush to the corners of my eyes. He was not my fiancé, the one I had loved for over a decade, who ran off with another Omega right before our wedding. He was the fiancé's older brother, dragged in by his family to clean up the mess. The man who hadn't spared me a single extra glance since we got married. Seeing me trembling uncontrollably under the agonizing torture of my heat, the man's heavy disguise finally ripped apart. Boom! A massive, overwhelming visual phenomenon of a deep green, ancient forest crashed into the room like a tidal wave, instantly swallowing all the golden sparks. His broad, scalding palm slammed over my eyes, dragging me completely into the dark. The man's heavy, ragged breathing splashed against the back of my neck. His voice dripped with a terrifying, absolute domination. This time, you don't get the chance to regret. Main text. The pale, ghostly glow of the phone screen illuminated Oscar's colorless face in the dim bedroom. The text message on the screen. Sorry, Oscar, but if we really get married, all three of us will just be miserable, acted like a cold steel carving knife, etching a night of dead silence into his heavily bloodshot eyes. His childhood sweetheart, an alpha with a top-tier compatibility match, his soon-to-be husband, had vanished into thin air on the eve of their wedding. Over the years, the interests of their two families had become deeply intertwined. They were currently collaborating on a crucial project. The entire industry was watching, and the news of their union had long been made public. Unable to locate the runaway groom, the Brown family had no choice but to come to their door to apologize. The massive grandfather clock ticked with a heavy, oppressive rhythm. The elders of the Brown family hung their heads low. Oscar sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa like a lifeless piece of exquisite white porcelain, his fingernails digging fiercely into his palms. In the deepest, heaviest shadow of the conference room sat Robert. This alpha, who spent most of his time overseas, was like an immovable glacier of black ice. His legs were crossed, his sharply tailored suit free of a single wrinkle. He looked like an entirely detached observer, right up until the proposal, changed the groom to Robert, smashed into the dead water like a massive boulder. Oscar's mother bolted upright, her chest heaving violently, her trembling finger nearly jabbing the Brown family head in the nose. But faced with a chain of lucrative interests on the verge of snapping, all fury was violently suppressed. Oscar slowly uncurled his white-knuckled fist, leaving deep red crescent moons gouged into his palm. "Mom, I can marry him." He lowered his eyelashes, his voice raspy as if ground over sandpaper. The chaotic conference room fell instantly, deathly silent. Everyone's gaze swiveled toward the corner like a bank of searchlights. Robert, who had been as silent as a statue, finally showed a nearly imperceptible rise and fall in his broad shoulders. With an incredibly slow, devastatingly oppressive frame rate, he lifted his eyelids. His impossibly deep, freezing gaze cut through the heavy crowd and landed precisely on the flushed red corners of Oscar's eyes. No warmth, no turbulence, only the incredibly sharp, lethal curve of his jawline suddenly pulling tight. "Fine." The single syllable struck the ground with inescapable weight. At the grand wedding venue, the blinding spotlight carved them out within the exact same halo of pure white light. When Robert slid the freezing platinum band onto Oscar's ring finger, the friction of the metal against his skin caused Oscar's pupils to dilate slightly. A year ago, amidst these exact same cheers, Thomas had knelt on one knee with a blinding, sunny smile. But right now, what violently yanked Oscar back to reality was a broad, slightly calloused palm pressing against his cheek. Robert lowered his head, his prominent brow ridge casting deep, heavy shadows over his eye sockets. He pressed an incredibly light, yet overwhelmingly dominant kiss to the corner of Oscar's stiff mouth. That dangerous, lethal restraint of a true apex predator sent a violent shudder racing straight up Oscar's spine. Late that night, the heavy door of the bridal suite locked with a muffled thud. An extreme, agonizing heat was actively shredding Oscar's sanity. He curled up on the massive marital bed, a sickly flush spreading from his neck all the way to the corners of his eye. He gasped violently for air, like a fish completely drained of water. His heat had erupted without a single warning. The bathroom door was pushed open. Robert's motion of drying his hair stopped dead. Oscar gripped the edge of the blanket in a vice, his fingertips turning a translucent, ghostly white from the force. Go. Get suppressants. Before he could even finish the sentence, driven entirely by feral instinct, he violently grabbed the hem of Robert's bathrobe. Mark me. Boom! The air in the room visibly twisted and warped in that exact second. The veins on the back of Robert's hand, hanging by his side, bulged violently. The rhythm of his breathing instantly lost a beat. Dragged by his spiraling loss of control, the warm lighting of the entire room began to eerily plummet in temperature, flickering before being completely swallowed by a deep, freezing, dark green halo. The shadows on the walls began to lengthen and distort frantically, like countless thick ancient vines winding their way up the bedposts. The air grew impossibly damp and crushing, as if the entire bedroom had been violently dragged into the depths of a torrential, primordial black forest. The sheer visual domination squeezed every inch of space, even causing the glass of the floor to ceiling windows to vibrate faintly under the unbearable pressure. You don't have to force yourself. Robert's voice was impossibly dark and husky, the resonance in his chest vibrating through the stagnant air. Oscar shook his head in pure agony, his sweat-soaked bangs plastered to his cheeks. Help me, Robert. The vine, like dark green shadows, instantly exploded, completely engulfing the massive bed. Robert's towering frame crashed down, blocking out the sky. His scalding fingers clamped onto Oscar's jaw, ruthlessly forcing him to release the badly chewed blanket, shoving his own palm in instead. His other hand acted like a steel vice, pinning Oscar's trembling shoulder dead against the mattress. As the man's hot, heavy breathing splashed against the fragile gland at the back of his neck, Oscar gently closed his eyes. The agonizing pain of being pierced swept through his entire body, accompanied by a terrifying, absolute sense of invasion. Oscar threw his head back, the fragile line of his neck pulled taut, his teeth sinking viciously into Robert's palm. As the temporary mark was completed, the suffocating, deep, green phenomena in the room began to recede like the tide. The twisted shadows of vines dissolved into countless faint, glowing specks, drifting down like snow before finally settling into total calm. Oscar collapsed limply into Robert's solid embrace. A single, scalding tear slipped from the corner of his eye, smashing against the back of the man's bloodied hand. I'm sorry. Robert lifted that bitten hand, the rough pad of his thumb gently wiping away the tear track at the corner of his eye. His impossibly deep eyes reflected Oscar's exhausted, sleeping face. The next morning, massive pools of sunlight spilled across the first-floor dining room. Robert sat at the far end of the long table, his black dress shirt buttoned all the way to the top. His fingers tapped out a freezing, rhythmic cadence on his keyboard. A cup of black coffee sat on the table. Behind him were massive floor, two ceiling windows, and a vibrant courtyard. Oscar held onto the stair railing, quietly observing this man. Thomas had always been like a loud, blinding sun. But Robert was like a bottomless, ancient forest, capable of swallowing everything whole. The keyboard clicking stopped. Robert lifted his eyes, his intensely piercing gaze locking onto Oscar on the stairs. He tilted his head slightly, motioning for him to come over. Oscar stepped forward and was immediately caught by a massive hand. Robert leaned in slightly, brushing aside the hair at the back of his neck. His deep, unfathomable gaze swept over the bright red bite mark that belonged entirely to him. Not bad, he stated, his tone flat, withdrawing his hand. Oscar sat across from him, looking down and cutting the food on his plate. This overwhelmingly powerful alpha, who had been unreachable since childhood, who had always acted like a freezing, distant elder, was now his legally closest family, the one who had completely ensnared him with his pheromones. Compared to Thomas' flashy, almost childishly intense passion, Robert was more like an unfathomable rain, silently and completely covering his entire world. The wound on the back of his neck still throbbed faintly, but within the barren ruins of his heart, a single tiny sprout of green quietly broke through amidst this freezing tenderness. The half-month honeymoon leave was like hitting the mute button on the world. In the master bedroom at night, only the intersecting sounds of their breathing rose and fell across the massive bed. Oscar lay rigidly on his back, his hands crossed defensively over his stomach, like a fragile piece of porcelain. With his back turned, Robert didn't move. He simply, silently released his pheromones into the dark. The dead air in the bedroom began to ripple. Wisps of thin, deep green mist began to rise from Robert's back. This visual phenomena, carrying a damp, cool chill, acted like living vines. They slithered silently across the dark silk sheets, inch by inch winding around Oscar's tense wrists and ankles. The surrounding light seemed to be forcibly filtered out. The entire bed was plunged into the silent depths of a dark forest, isolating them from all the cold, hard edges of the outside world. Cocooned within this materialized, gentle, dark green halo, like a forest just after the rain, the tight knot between Oscar's brows began to slowly smooth out. By the second half of the night, guided by the deep, green mist, that originally rigid body had instinctively dropped its defenses, rolling right into that broad, scalding embrace. Half a month later, Oscar finally returned to the office. The company erupted with oblivious congratulations. Multicolored confetti rained down from the ceiling as his coworkers laughed and cheered, celebrating Oscar and Thomas finally tying the knot. Oscar stopped in his tracks. He swept a freezing gaze over the floating confetti, his jawline locked into a cold, ruthless curve. "I did not marry Thomas." He enunciated every word cleanly, his gaze sharp as shattered ice, instantly freezing the surrounding chaos. "My husband is someone else." In the dead silence, Thomas, who had been missing for half a month, stood at the end of the hallway, looking exactly like a stray dog caught in the rain. On the rooftop, the wind violently whipped the hem of Oscar's trench coat. He looked down coldly at the alpha he had once believed he would spend the rest of his life with. "I'm sorry. I never thought you'd marry my brother." Thomas hung his head, his eyes bloodshot, his hands buried agonizingly in his hair. Furious beyond words, Oscar let out a dark laugh, his chest heaving violently. He violently grabbed Thomas by the collar, forcing him to look up. "What the hell is the point of saying sorry now?" Oscar's voice tore through the wind. "You leave behind an absolute disaster and make your brother carry the weight for you. You are nothing but a coward who only knows how to run." Thomas violently grabbed Oscar's wrist, desperately leaning in. "Oscar, if you want a divorce, I can help. A marriage without love will never make you happy." Smack. Without a single microsecond of hesitation, Oscar ruthlessly threw a right hook, his knuckles smashing violently against Thomas' jawbone. Thomas staggered backward, a blinding streak of crimson instantly oozing from the corner of his mouth. Oscar shook out his numb knuckles, his eyes overflowing with pure, freezing disgust. "Don't think him as garbage as you are. Your brother is 10,000 times the man you'll ever be." He turned on his heel, not leaving behind a single extra glance. In the dim light of the emergency stairwell, the new intern, Noah, was huddled in the corner. The corners of his eyes were flushed with a pitiful, delicate red. "I'm so sorry, Manager Oscar. I never meant to ruin your relationship." Oscar's footsteps didn't even pause for half a second. He turned his face slightly, his eyes brimming with absolute mocking contempt. "Never meant to ruin it, but still rolled into his bed? Are you a professional victim? Get the hell out of my way." He swept past, leaving a sharp gust of wind that brushed against Noah's deathly pale face, violently cutting off any impending entanglement before it could even begin. Twilight descended, emptying the office floor as the blinds sliced the fading amber light into fragmented shadows. Oscar was gathering his documents when a sudden darkness swallowed his line of sight. Like a lingering phantom, Thomas aggressively shoved a velvet box containing a jade pendant onto the desk, a gift from Oscar's father. "Oscar, if you regret it, I can." He suddenly reached out, trying to grab Oscar's wrist. The very second Thomas' fingertips were about to brush against Oscar's skin, a sharply defined hand, cuffs secured with cold platinum links, struck from behind like a raptor's talon. Smack. It ruthlessly struck Thomas' hand away, without a single ounce of mercy. The sharp crack echoed through the dead silence of the office. In the next breath, a powerful arm wrapped securely around Oscar's waist with inescapable magnetism, yanking him backward and locking him firmly against a solid chest, radiating an overwhelming deep green halo. Robert stood behind Oscar, his black suit acting as an insurmountable wall of iron. With his proximity, the surrounding light instantly dropped a few degrees. The deep, green visual phenomena spread frantically across the floor, acting like solid, thick vines that enclosed the two of them within an absolute, heavily guarded territory. "Little brother." Robert lowered his head slightly, his razor-sharp jawline resting against the crown of Oscar's hair. His impossibly deep eyes locked onto Thomas like an apex predator eyeing its prey. His voice was devastatingly low, yet carried a dominating tension that crushed everything in its path. "When you speak to your brother-in-law, mind your manners." Gasps echoed around them. A few lingering employees froze in sheer terror, though their fingers frantically blind, typed across their screens. Thomas clutched his rapidly swelling hand, staring in utter disbelief at the hand locked securely around Oscar's waist, his gaze instantly filling with hostility. "Brother, you shouldn't have taken advantage of him. You clearly—" "Thomas." Robert narrowed his eyes dangerously, a chilling dark gleam surging in the depths of his pupils. The sprawling shadows of green vines instantly exploded outward, lunging toward the tips of Thomas' shoes like giant pythons, bringing a suffocating, absolute domination. "As an adult, you need to go give an explanation to the people you dragged down with you. Mom and Dad are still waiting for you to come home." The air completely solidified. Crushed beneath that absolute hierarchy and inescapable magnetism, Thomas ground his back teeth, his Adam's apple bobbing with immense difficulty. "Fine." He squeezed the word through his teeth and turned away in utter defeat. And Robert's hand remained dead-locked against Oscar's waist like a branding iron, not loosening a single fraction. A suffocating silence flowed through the cabin of the Maybach. The speeding neon lights outside the window acted like liquid blades, slicing through the dim space time and time again. Oscar leaned back against the leather seat, closing his eyes amidst the exhaustion of the past few days, his breathing slowly steadying. He didn't know how long had passed, but when he opened his eyes again, his vision was instantly filled with the man's incredibly close profile. Robert's straight nose brushed right past his, the man's deep, set features radiating absolute domination in the shadows of the car, like a marble statue. Click! A crisp sound rang out as the metal buckle of the seatbelt was popped open by those sharply defined fingers. That undeniable, fiercely predatory masculine scent made Oscar subconsciously hold his breath. It wasn't until the man retreated back to the driver's seat that Oscar felt the air in his lungs begin to flow again. The clinking of dishes at dinner was fast, forwarded in a blur. The clock hands pointed to 1 a.m. The lights in the master bedroom were dimmed to their absolute lowest. Robert pushed open the bathroom door, carrying a chilled, damp aura. Fine water droplets traced the sharp ridges of his abs, disappearing beneath the edge of his pure black towel. Oscar sat cross-legged on the velvet duvet, his fingertips unconsciously gripping the sheets. "We need to talk." Robert's motion of drying his hair paused slightly before he calmly stepped onto the bed, sitting directly opposite Oscar. Accompanying his proximity, a visible, deep, green halo quietly rippled through the air. That faint light, carrying the texture of morning dew and moss, acted like supple vines growing in the night. They climbed silently along the dark sheets, inch by inch winding around Oscar's tense ankles, cocooning him entirely within a silent, secure visual greenhouse. Unconsciously, Oscar's furrowed brow smoothed out within the deep green. "Even though this is a business marriage, if there isn't anyone else you love, we can try to make a good life together." Oscar lowered his eyelashes, trying his hardest to maintain a rational, steady tone. "If you ever meet someone you do fall for in the future, we can end this relationship amicably." The deep, green halo vibrated violently in the air for a fraction of a second. Robert's dark, heavy eyes locked onto him like a hawk claiming its prey, piercing straight into the depths of Oscar's eyes without yielding a single inch. "I won't." "What?" "I will not willingly give up on this marriage." The man's tone sounded like he was handing down an irrevocable corporate verdict, laced with absolute dominion and certainty. Because I married you of my own free will. You are exceptional. It is entirely normal for people to fall for you, and that includes me. So you don't need to worry about this marriage being loveless. I have a feeling I'm going to fall in love with you. This blunt, possessive declaration hit like a massive bombshell. Oscar's eyes widened instantly, a visible, fiery flush rapidly spreading across his pale cheeks, burning all the way to the tips of his ears. Tentatively, he shifted forward half an inch, almost trembling as he leaned in. In the very next second, Robert's broad arms clamped shut, fiercely yanking Oscar entirely into that overwhelming, deep green tapestry of light and shadow. It was an embrace steeped in absolute claiming, allowing no room for escape. The next morning, massive swaths of morning light poured over the long dining table like shattered gold. Oscar had changed into a custom, tailored, light blue suit, the crisp fabric perfectly tracing the supple curve of his waist. He walked up to Robert, tugging at his cuffs somewhat awkwardly to mask his nerves. "How does this look?" The fingers holding the coffee cup tightened slightly. Robert's dark, smoldering gaze roamed like a lethal beast patrolling its territory, sliding all the way from Oscar's glossy lips down to the slender waist wrapped in the tailored suit. Without a single warning, Robert suddenly shot his hand out, gripping Oscar's wrist like a steel vise and yanking down. The world spun. Losing his balance, Oscar fell heavily onto the man's solid, scalding thighs. Robert's left arm locked around that supple waist with inescapable iron gravity, while the rough pad of his right thumb dangerously caressed the fading mark at the back of his neck. Within those impossibly deep eyes, an undisguised, raw, predatory hunger churned violently. He closed the distance with staggering domination. "May I?" Before Oscar could even manage a flustered nod, a kiss like a torrential storm crashed down upon him. This was no gentleman's polite taste. It was the absolute, bone-deep instinct of an alpha claiming their mate. Robert dominated him, parting his lips with irresistible magnetism, greedily devouring every last trace of oxygen. The surrounding light seemed violently stretched and warped in that moment. The once bright dining room sliced into dark, sharp shadows by their intertwined silhouettes. Oscar went completely boneless, his only anchor the death grip he had on the front of Robert's shirt, his knuckles turning ghostly white. When the kiss finally broke, he gasped for air like a dying fish, a devastatingly beautiful flush forced to the corners of his eyes. All he could do was melt weakly, burying his burning cheek into the dangerously scented crook of the man's neck. The gossip on the office floor showed no signs of stopping. The animated mouthing of his coworkers, their feverish worship of Robert's self-made, mature charisma, and their utter contempt for Thomas Playboy, trust fund behavior. Oscar stood by his cubicle, coldly sweeping his gaze over these animated faces, and calmly dropped a depth chart. "Once these two projects are finished, I'm leaving the company to start my own firm." The collective gasp of regret hadn't even faded before Noah's paper, white face appeared at the end of the hallway. The temperature plummeted. His coworkers' gazes instantly flipped to undisguised mockery and disdain. Thomas, unhinged lunatic, like public argument with this interloper last night, had already surged through the cold data streams, lighting up every phone screen in the company. Oscar couldn't even be bothered to spare a passing glance at the shivering intern pressed against the wall. His mind rapidly flashed through that thick investigation report. Surveillance screenshots from cheap motels, deliberately faked heats, the pathetic illusion of mutual salvation. A pile of nauseating black and white trash. A freezing bone, deep sneer curled the corner of Oscar's mouth. He turned and walked toward his office. A sudden wave of dark relief washed over him. Thank God it happened before the wedding. Any later, and it would have been a real mess. A month flew by, seemingly placed on a quiet fast forward. Inside the luxurious penthouse, two originally parallel trajectories began to overlap. A light kiss pressed to the temple in the morning, the seamless handoff of a briefcase at the entryway. The picture grew harmonious in the most unspoken ways. However, beneath it all, a certain taut, Forbidden tension remained strung tight between them. Until that night, when the scorching tide of a heat utterly destroyed the facade of restraint. The air in the master bedroom turned unbearably thick, like boiling syrup. A blinding amber halo, the manifestation of Oscar's spiraling loss of control, silently detonated in the dim room. The light acted like golden sparks suspended in the air, flaring and fading in time with his ragged breaths. Oscar curled up in the center of the massive bed, a devastating feverish red burning at the corners of his eyes. He stared at the suppressants on the nightstand for a long time. Ultimately, he chose to sweep them onto the floor, listening to the sharp sound of shattering glass. Then, he pulled out his phone and sent a text to Robert, "Hurry home." The heavy solid wood door was shoved violently open. Robert stood in the doorway. His previously immaculate tie was yanked loose, his suit jacket long abandoned. The very second he stepped into the room, an overwhelming deep green shadow, as profound as a midnight forest, surged in with avalanche, like force, violently colliding with the room full of amber sparks in a massive visual shockwave. He stared dead at the shattered glass on the floor. His prominent Adam's apple bobbed violently. His eyes, normally as stagnant as an ancient well, were now churning with a lethally dangerous undercurrent. "Should I have someone bring more?" His voice was pulled tight as a bowstring, gravelly and raw. Sinking into the soft bedding, Oscar glared viciously at him, his eyes glistening, entirely consumed by the agonizing torture of desire. That deep green shadow instantly exploded outward. Robert carelessly slammed his phone onto the dresser. Like a terrifyingly dominant apex predator, his towering frame completely shadowed Oscar from above. He leaned down slowly, his broad, scalding palm ruthlessly covering Oscar's eyes, dragging him completely into the dark. "Are you sure?" The man's sigh landed at a devastatingly close range, carrying an irresistible, unyielding command. "This time, you don't get to regret it." In the next heartbeat, the Alpha's massive, deep green shadows instantly devoured those amber sparks as the towering body crashed down upon him. Intertwined silhouettes, sweat, soaked silk sheets, and Oscar's bone, white knuckles digging fiercely into the man's broad back as he sobbed to the point of exhaustion. Utter domination and desperate claiming performed their most primal dance in the shadows of the dim room. It wasn't until a day and 2 nights later that the torrential storm finally broke. Massive swaths of sunlight reclaimed the first-floor dining room. Dressed in soft loungewear, Oscar leaned lazily against Robert's broad chest. Robert held a porcelain bowl, his sharply defined fingers gripping a white spoon as he brought the warm porridge to Oscar's lips. Oscar narrowed his eyes, a languid curve tugging at the corner of his mouth. The dark circles under his eyes and the striking bite mark on his nape silently told the story of that breathtaking, overwhelming marking. Time flowed rapidly forward. Sunlight poured through the glass dome of the Wilson family's greenhouse garden. Oscar's mother carefully examined her son. Though his frame was a bit leaner, the unique, luminous glow around his eyes and brows, the undeniable sign of being completely marked, couldn't be faked. "Since you two are building a good foundation, my mind is finally at ease." She gently brushed the leaves of an orchid. Oscar held a pure copper watering can, the crystal, clear droplets catching the sunlight. Looking back, what Thomas did turned out to be a good thing. It pulled me back from the wrong path. Him running out on the wedding showed me exactly who he is. Even if we had gotten married smoothly, what was bound to happen would have happened eventually. He lowered his eyelashes, his expression as calm as if he were recounting someone else's story. The gloom of the past couldn't even stir a single ripple within this vibrant sea of green. Night fell, leaving only a cold, toned reading lamp illuminated in the study. The fluorescent glow of the computer screen washed over the sharp, chiseled planes of Robert's profile. Facing the camera, his thin lips parted slightly as low, magnetic syllables of French flowed through the quiet room. Oscar was curled up on the leather sofa far across the room, the personnel files for his new company open on his screen. Yet, his gaze kept involuntarily drifting past the monitor, tracing the deep, set ridges of the man's brow. The chime signaling the end of the video conference had barely sounded when that towering silhouette silently pressed down behind the sofa. A shadow enveloped him. Robert lowered his head, his impossibly deep gaze sweeping over the roster on the screen, before suddenly whispering a fluent line of French right by Oscar's ear. Before Oscar could even react, the man's fingers had forcefully tilted his chin up, landing a highly aggressive, claiming kiss. "If I poach them all, will you be mad?" Oscar gasped, a watery sheen in his eyes. Robert's large hand kneaded the supple curve of Oscar's lower back with heavy implication. A dangerous curve hooked the corner of his thin lips. "Good job." He'll still hand out their year-end bonuses to reward them for their excellent taste. But before that, the man's gaze darkened significantly, informally requesting an advance on my returns. Time fast forwarded to the 60th birthday banquet of the Brown family's patriarch. The crystal chandeliers refracted a lavish, intoxicating light. Amidst the swirling gowns and expensive cologne, Robert held a glass of champagne, navigating the high society crowd with effortless grace. His black tuxedo made him look like a sovereign patrolling his empire. Standing a short distance away, Oscar swept a cold gaze over the faces attempting to curry favor, eventually turning and pushing open the glass doors leading to the back garden alone. The late autumn garden was bone, chillingly cold. The moonlight was a sickly pale, the rustling shadows of the trees draping over the swing set like a massive cage. Oscar sat on the swing, the crisp wind lifting his hair. Suddenly, a suit jacket still holding a trace of body heat fell over his shoulders. He looked up, the gentle smile on his lips violently shattering into ice, the second he recognized the person standing there. Thomas stood less than half a meter away. His eyes were heavily bloodshot, carrying the profound exhaustion of overindulgence and an agonizing, deep-seated remorse. "Careful, don't catch a cold." His voice was as dry as if he had swallowed sand. Oscar stood up, his face devoid of all emotion. His pale fingers pinched the edge of the jacket, yanking it off in pure disgust and shoving it right back at the man's chest. The movement was clean, sharp, and merciless. "Oscar, we shouldn't be this distant." Thomas' spine bent in agony, his hands violently covering his face. He began a desperate confession, moving from the cheap thrill Noah offered to the ultimate realization of a deep, inescapable love he couldn't shake. I actually love you. I was just blinded by the novelty of it. Oscar, I think I'm sick." He threw his head up, his bloodshot eyes locking onto Oscar as his fingers spasmed, desperately trying to grab his shoulders. Oscar swiftly stepped back twice, perfectly dodging those trembling hands. He looked down from an insurmountable height at this alpha, who used to have eyes only for him. His gaze was like looking at a pile of unrecyclable trash. "You are sick. You've got a disease called being pathetic." Oscar's jawline pulled into an incredibly sharp, ruthless curve, his tone like a blade dipped in liquid nitrogen. "I should actually thank you. Thank you for showing me what a cowardly, childish, disgusting face you truly have." Without a single microsecond of hesitation, he turned on his heel. The hem of his trench coat drew an absolute final arc in the freezing moonlight. At the end of the path, beneath a massive sycamore tree, amidst the falling leaves, Robert stood there in absolute silence. The air around him seemed compressed to its absolute limit. A terrifying, deep, green shadow frantically churned and roared around his feet, yet was forcefully suppressed within a few paces by his absolute ironclad rationality. Oscar walked quickly toward him. In silence, Robert extended his hand. His broad, scalding palm firmly engulfed Oscar's freezing fingertips. "Let's go home." Two simple words that severed every last trace of entanglement behind them. Late at night in the master bedroom, the warm yellow wall sconces cast a soft halo. One side of the massive bed dipped slightly. Oscar opened his eyes, looking at the deeply frowning man beside him, clearly weighed down by something. Stripped of his daytime dominant composure, under the dim light, Robert revealed a rare trace of vulnerability. Oscar sat up and opened his arms. Like a massive beast finally finding its sanctuary, Robert leaned in, pulling Oscar violently into his embrace. He buried his chin dead into the crook of Oscar's neck and took a deep, shuddering breath. "You're upset." Oscar threaded his fingers through the man's stiff, short hair. After a long silence, a muffled voice came from his neck. "I'm jealous. You two have so much history I can never replace. I'm terrified your heart will soften. Terrified you'll give up on me." Those frantic, roaring, deep green shadows instantly dissolved into an uneasy, trembling glimmer. Oscar cupped the man's sharp, cold face, his clear eyes reflecting all of Robert's insecurities. "I only look at the present and the future. And you are my everything." Robert froze for a second before a thick, unbreakable devotion violently exploded in the depths of his eyes. He let out a low laugh, a rare flush touching the tips of his ears, and kissed those lips that spoke such beautiful words, with an urgent, chaotic hunger. The two of them laughed, tumbling across the bed in a tangle of limbs. "Who was that girl in the white dress who kept smiling at you?" Oscar suddenly pressed a hand against his chest, raising an eyebrow. Robert's laughter vibrated violently in his chest, making Oscar's fingers go numb. He effortlessly pinned Oscar back beneath him, his fingers restlessly slipping under the hem of his pajamas, the amusement in his eyes practically spilling over. "A distant cousin. She just wanted autographed photos of the celebrities under my company's label." Oscar threw his head back, exposing the fragile, vulnerable lines of his long neck. His breathing completely lost its rhythm under the man's scorching, relentless assault. Within that warm halo of light, all suspicion and shadows dissolved into nothingness amidst their intertwining body heat. Robert's extra. From a young age, Robert was the perfect child everyone talked about. Steady, brilliant, with unwavering focus. Like a precision-engineered machine, he was relentlessly driven forward by countless blinding trophies and cold prey. His early life was a flawless, impenetrable blueprint until the anomaly known as Oscar crashed in. Oscar and his younger brother Thomas grew up together. Robert saw it with crystal clarity. Oscar's seemingly bossy attitude toward Thomas hid a deeply indulgent, guiding nature. That reckless, headstrong younger brother was being pulled onto the right track, inch, by Oscar. Jealousy, like a cold, venomous snake, silently coiled itself around Robert's rigid spine. In the dead of the silent night, deep, green phenomena frantically bred around Robert's bed. In his dreams, Oscar would narrow those liquid peach, blossom eyes, leaning in close to his ear with a soft laugh. The second he woke, Robert bolted upright, his chest heaving violently. The out-of-control, deep green halo in the air, like a dense, bottomless forest, carried an incredibly aggressive visual pressure, nearly overturning the entire room. He stared dead at his slightly trembling palm, his sharp jawline locking into a ruthless, unfeeling curve. To completely choke out this malfunctioning heart, he boarded a flight overseas without a single backward glance, forcibly freezing over the swamp that nearly swallowed him whole. Years of time were rapidly folded away. At the welcome back banquet, the spotlights were like snow-white blades. Thomas knelt on one knee, offering a diamond engagement ring to Oscar. The crowd was boiling with excitement. Robert stood at the absolute outer edge of the room. His pure black suit acted like a layer of armor, isolating him from everything. He raised the hand wearing the luxury watch, his sharply defined fingers slowly pressing against his left chest. Steady. Not a single ripple. He turned away, coldly, leaving the perfect couple behind, striding firmly back onto his own flawless track. Yet, a year later, the storm violently descended. Inside the conference room, the furious patriarch shattered a teacup, porcelain shards flying across the Persian rug. Within that suffocating dead silence, the proposal to substitute for the brother hit like a massive bombshell. Robert, who had been completely hidden in the heaviest, deepest shadow, didn't hesitate for even half a millisecond. With agonizing slowness, he lifted his eyes. The deep green forest at the bottom of his gaze, which had been frozen solid for years, instantly shattered and let out a silent, deafening roar. Fine. The low syllable slammed into the ground, carrying an absolute, irresistible command. At that grand wedding venue, under the blinding spotlights, Robert's broad, scalding palm, with an absolutely dominating stance, tightly engulfed Oscar's trembling fingertips. The freezing platinum diamond ring was forced, inch by inch, down the pale ring finger. The exact millisecond the metal locked against the base of the finger, the muscles beneath Robert's suit violently snapped taut. The surrounding air began to visibly warp. An incredibly faint, deeply predatory deep, green halo silently snaked along their connected fingertips, acting like inescapable chains securely binding the Omega before him. Robert slowly lowered his head, his abyss, like eyes locking dead onto Oscar's face. The heart in his chest, the one he had convinced himself was long dead, was violently smashing against his ribs with a destructive, unhinged frequency. The massive beast that had lain dormant for years finally stepped out of the jungle. His chance had finally arrived.
The story ends here. I absolutely love Oscar's character. He dares to love, dares to hate, and faces his responsibilities with unflinching courage. When met with betrayal, he refuses to drown in the past, bravely carving out a brand, new beginning instead. In reality, there are plenty of people out there just like Thomas. They revel in being worshipped, arrogantly believing they are somehow superior. They have no idea how to cherish what they hold, nor do they understand the first thing about love. Thomas saw Oscar's absolute devotion as a shackle, an inescapable burden, a mere boring pastime. But in the eyes of Robert, a man completely captivated by him, Oscar is an absolute treasure. He is brilliant, brave, and kind-hearted. He fiercely shoulders his family's burdens, builds his own company to chase his dreams, actively embraces a new relationship, and still knows exactly how to gently soothe a fiercely jealous Robert. Just as Robert said, anyone who gets close to Oscar is destined to fall for him. He simply possesses an irresistible magnetism. Robert was the first to see through the dust and recognize the treasure beneath, and so he ruthlessly seized his one and only chance to claim him. As for Thomas, right up until the bitter end, it was only the stinging void of losing Oscar that made him realize he had thrown away a treasure. He didn't suddenly wake up and realize Oscar was his true love. He simply couldn't stomach the reality of losing someone who had worshipped him unconditionally. I hope everyone reading this finds someone who respects you, someone who truly, deeply loves you, not just some arrogant bastard who only wants to revel in the feeling of being loved.